This film has been compiled by members of the Sunbeam Talbot Darracq Register in 2003 to mark the centenary of the Talbot motor car. It highlights a few of the characters, events and models from the 35 years of production of Talbot cars. But firstly, you must cast your mind back over 100 years to the turn of that century when the British Empire was at its peak and British industry dominated the world. The craze for cycling gave people a freedom and mobility never known before. Amongst the busy London streets, the inquisitive may have heard of houses being illuminated with electricity, of moving picture shows, of wireless radio broadcasts and experiments with heavier-than-air flying machines. Was there nothing the ingenuity of man couldn't produce? It was against this background of excitement at the development of new technologies that the firm of Clement Talbot was formed as a legal entity on the 11th of October 1902 by the Earl of Shrewsbury and Talbot, who provided the finance, and by Adolphe Clement, who had the motor industry expertise. The Earl of Shrewsbury and Talbot, through his many business and social contacts throughout Europe, was well aware of the motor car's potential, which was suppressed in Britain. At this time, France led the new and growing motor car industry, producing more cars than all the other countries in the world put together. French production was growing by 50% each year at the turn of the century, yet demand was still not being met. Half of this production was exported, and half of the exports went to Britain. This means that perhaps 4,000 French cars were imported into Britain in 1902, while such British companies as Argyll and Sunbeam made only 50 or 60 cars each. The Earl was already very much involved, and through one of his companies, the British Automobile Commercial Syndicate, he was a major importer. Adolphe Clement made his fortune in the infant bicycle industry, and by acquiring the patent rights in France for Dunlop tyres. As well as producing his own motorcycles and cars from the 1890s, he was a major component supplier to many other companies. He was on the board of Darracq, Gladiator and Humber, and chairman of Panhard Vassar. He went on to produce aircraft and dirigibles. His cars were regular successful competitors in French road races, some driven by his sons, or Danny Veagle, who was the sales manager of the British Automobile Commercial Syndicate. This is one of Clement's winning teams. This quintet was the only complete team to finish the 1902 Paris to Vienna race, beating 123 of the 137 competitors. Clearly there was a great opportunity for a major new British motor manufacturer, and construction of the new factory in Kensington was soon underway. At first, complete Clement cars were imported and sold as Talbots, but as the factory neared completion, more of the construction was done in London, until the first complete British-built Talbot was made in August 1905, at 1216 horsepower. The new factory was state-of-the-art in every respect. The front building housed the entrance hall and showroom, with marble floors, stained glass windows and ornate plasterwork. The offices were oak-panelled. All this was indicative of the firm's high aspirations. Asking the operator for Paddington 695 would get you straight through to the boardroom. The turbines to power the whole works were imported from the United States and were housed in their own ornate galleried hall. The factory itself was very modern in style, with multi-gabled roofs with south-facing glass to let in maximum light. It included everything, even its own foundry for casting cylinder blocks. It incorporated a revolutionary flexible shop system, where one building was used for various purposes. Here we see the light and airy machine shops, with a massive system of drive belts powering each machine. Motor assembly. And construction of the chassis frames. the erecting shop where all the parts start to come together into the finished motor cars. The spacious finishing shop. These are fascinating pictures of the infancy of a great industry. The new Talbot factory included all the very latest equipment and used all the most modern methods and production techniques. These pictures were taken because of the pride and excitement in all that was happening here, in the new industry, which would transform the 20th century just as computers are already transforming the 21st. Every car was tested on the test track which ran round the outside of the works. In the period up to the Great War, Talbots had enormous success in reliability trials across the world, and it was at this time that they gained the name the Invincible Talbot, which was appropriate throughout the life of the company. Even the smallest Talbot, the 810 horsepower, won the Irish Reliability Trial of 1906 and the world's record for petrol consumption at 57 miles per gallon. Major feats included the non-stop round Britain 2,000-mile, 124-hour drive by Danny Veagle on a 20-horsepower Talbot in 1904, an amazing feat of endurance of man and car, proving that Talbots were reliable at a time when so many primitive machines were not. The first car to cross Australia was a 25-horsepower Talbot which managed the 2,000 miles across uncharted desert and scrub from Adelaide to Darwin in 1908, a truly amazing journey, across rocky dry riverbeds, through floods, and across sand dunes. As the chain attached to the front of the car shows, at times not even 8 wheels could grip without a little help. This poster shows perhaps the greatest achievement of the time. In 1913, the all-British Invincible Talbot, driven by Mr. Percy Lambert, the first car in the world to travel 100 miles in 1 hour. What an achievement! As befitted the occasion, a cinematograph film was taken, forming a permanent record of this historic event. The 25 horsepower, 4,531 cc car of standard touring dimensions in fact covered 103 3/4 miles from a standing start, 26 miles per hour faster than any previous record set by an equally rated car. Here, engineers make final checks, overseen by Frank Shawland, general manager, before the car leaves the factory. The car certainly aroused considerable interest as it drove through Kingston and Cobham to the Brooklands racetrack. The Earl of Shrewsbury waves the driver good luck. The car was lightened as much as possible, with no silencer and only a transmission brake. Percy Lambert gets into the Talbot, gets ready, and is waved off by the Earl. After the first lap, the car kept a steady speed for all 38 laps. At 105 miles per hour, the engine was revving at 2,500 revolutions per minute, and the interior temperatures of the cylinders would have been over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, an extreme test of the engine's cooling system. The publicity after the event continued to stress the amazing feat of endurance and reliability. At this engine speed, there would be over 80 charges of petrol drawn into the cylinders, compressed, fired, expanded and swept out again every second of time for 3,600 consecutive seconds. Each piston travelled up and down its cylinder, 5.5 inches each way, over 80 times per second. To realise this rapidity of reciprocating motion, think of the beat of a wasp's wings, which are computed to number 100 per second. The speed was recorded using an automatic electric chronograph. The hour is up, and the Union flag declares a successful end to this great British victory. The record-breaking car comes in to cheers from the spectators. Percy Lambert looks exhausted, but quite rightly very pleased with himself. He is congratulated by the Earl of Shrewsbury and Talbot, with Major Lindsay Lloyd, the independent timekeeper, on the left. Sales rose year by year during this period, with about a third of production going to Australia and New Zealand. The most popular models were the 12 horsepower, of which 1,800 were made between 1907 and 1914, followed closely by the 15 horsepower, about 1,600 made. This one is competing in the 1908 Yorkshire Auto Club Hill Climb, and this 15 was the winner of the Johannesburg Speed Contest in 1909. Of course, all this time, hundreds of Talbots were just putting in reliable service, such as this 1912 2550, owned by the Scott family of Dundee, with chauffeur, on tour in Scotland. What was the chauffeur doing here? Taking the picture? The factory was continually enlarged, reaching twice its original size, and in 1914 over 800 Talbots were sold. This was twice the output of Vauxhall and Napier, about the same as Humber and Austin, and half the production of Sunbeams. The two largest English car manufacturers at this time were Ford, producing 6,000 cars, and Wolseley, 3,000. In all, over 35,000 cars and commercial vehicles were sold in Britain in 1914. There was no doubt of the build quality and reliability of these early Talbots, but had the grand commercial plans of 1902 succeeded? During the Great War, production continued, Clement Talbot being a main supplier of vehicles to the Royal Naval Air Service. Work also included assembly of other vehicles and aircraft engines, and no Talbots were built for 12 months in 1918 and 1919, while vehicles returning from active service were being reconditioned. On the 11th of October 1919, exactly 17 years after the formation of Clement Talbot Limited, it was announced that the company had been sold to Darracq, a British company operating mainly in France. The following year, the new group combined with Sunbeam to form STD Motors Limited. It was not until the end of 1921 that a new Talbot car was announced. Sales of the successful little Talbot 818 took production in 1922 to over 1,000 cars for the first time. The 818 continued Talbot's success in reliability trials, here taking part in the Scottish 6-day trial. Talbots were the top quality car for fashionable young ladies to be seen driving, including this great star of the stage and silver screen, Gladys Cooper. This is the Talbot 1023, launched for 1923. The marque still carried that status gained from supplying carriages to the nobility before the Great War. Launched at the same time were the larger 1230 models. Production rose to over 1,800 cars in 1923, the full capacity of the factory at that time. The brilliant Swiss engineer Georges Roche had joined Talbot in 1916. In 1926, he was to design a new motor car which, as it was developed, was to lead the company to many more successes over the next 10 years. The six-cylinder Talbot 1445 was an immediate success, and even with production over 2,000 cars in each of the following 3 years, there was a long wait for delivery. This was the heyday of English motoring, when it was still common to only use your motor car during the summer for weekend motoring on uncrowded roads. What could be better than a leisurely day out with friends in the Surrey countryside in your Talbot 1445 Tourer? Finding the Bell Inn at Oxted to stop for lunch. A trip to Petworth in the afternoon, and home to Penshurst again in time for tea. As the 1920s were coming to an end, the popularity of closed saloon bodies was increasing. This is the Wayman Sunshine Coupe, with golf clubs being stowed in the back by Bill Brunel, the photographer. The coach-built saloons were heavy compared to the new pressed steel bodies, and the 1445 with its 1666 cc engine was beginning to appear underpowered. So for 1930 the Talbot 75 was launched with an engine capacity a third bigger at 2276 cc's, giving 18 horsepower. The designation 75 signified the top speed. The 70 was a less stressed engine used for the colonial model. Exports to the Empire continued, but at a lower rate than before. This Australian show stand has saloon and tourer bodies on the Talbot 1445s. I'm reassured to see that even then every new car had an oil drip tray underneath. Perhaps this saloon was bought by Dr. Tregonning of Claremont, Western Australia, whose family we see here. It has an elaborate sprung bumper on the front. The 70 chassis was also used for ambulances, of which several hundred were sold to local authorities and ambulance boards. This is a big order for the London County Council, paraded outside the Talbot factory in the days when it was permissible to block the highway. This one is being demonstrated with patient at Passmore Ward's Cottage Hospital. And this one, outside the works, is in the livery of Kent County Council. No substantial investment had been made in the works for 20 years, and things look much the same except a lot more crowded. Sales were less than 1% of the total vehicles sold in Britain, but Talbots were not aimed at the mass market. Talbots produced traditional, hand-built quality cars with a sporting character, and it's worth some time looking round the factory at Barlby Road in North Kensington. His Royal Highness Prince George of Kent visited the factory, and here he is on the left, being shown round by Andrew Robertson, Talbot's sales manager. Let's now go on our tour of the works to see how Talbot cars were made.
The following promotional film, compiled we believe in 1932, takes us on a unique tour of the Talbot factory. We are shown the front of the building with its portico much the same as it is today. Mr. Robertson, the general manager, is obviously there to guide us through into the factory. This film covers all aspects of the production, including the bodybuilding Darracq works in Acton, through to the finished products ready for dispatch. The design office, where George Roche's design schemes will be converted into hundreds of design drawings, giving the detailed dimensions and material specifications to produce the castings and machine tools to be set up to finish manufacturing them. The vital records of all parts and any changes were kept in this department. Roche was uncompromising in matters of quality control, and as the inspectors on the shop floor would ensure that drawing tolerances were maintained, only Roche himself could make any concessions. Here a simple jig holds this 105 front axle, while the accurate 4-spindle multi-head drills the 4 spring clamping holes in one operation. The axis is turned around for the process to be repeated at the other end. Camshaft grinding is a copying process, whereby the cam form on the large master cam on the right-hand side is transferred exactly to the actual 105 camshaft on the left-hand side. The operator shows a 75 camshaft, where the helical gear that drives the distributor is midway between the widely spaced support bearings. For a high-performance car, the underbonnet view of a Talbot is functional rather than glamorous. A little enhancement obtained by polishing the steering box and its pedestal helps. Similarly, polished and plated Rudge Whitworth knock-ons are a necessary piece of bright work for this class of car. The crankshaft is maintained from a solid triangular section forged steel billet, in a specialised lathe able to provide rotation about the main centre line and then about the 3 big end centre lines in turn. The triangular section allows each crank throw to have weights fitted to provide 100% balance of reciprocating forces and hence smooth, high-speed running. The 7 main bearings are extremely narrow for 1930 but of large diameter and enabled Roche to produce a remarkably short 6-cylinder engine. The crankshaft grinding machine is used to produce the final very accurate and smooth surface finish ready for fitting with individually machined white metal connecting rods and main bearings. Here we see gear shaping on 18-tooth planet gears for the newly introduced pre-selector gearbox. The gear and reciprocating cutter are rotated whilst being brought into mesh, thus generating the involute tooth form. This 75 block is firmly clamped into its jig, ready for 6-spindle boring machine to cut all 6 cylinder bores simultaneously. The spindle spacing is 93 mm, and Roche determined to maintain this spacing when designing the 105-110 engine for reasons of cost, lead time and factory space. This expensive multi-head drilling unit for simultaneously drilling 23 holes in the sump face of a 75 block. Clearly another similarly expensive unit is necessary for the 105-110 engine. When the block is moved we can see very clearly how these holes were drilled. This single spindle bore grinding machine could make 75, 90, 105, 110 cylinder bores simply by changing the cutters and locating jigs. The inspection department are busy checking the new pre-selector gearbox parts. The aluminium casing is undergoing dimension checks on an accurate and flat surface table. The gearbox input shaft on the right is probably having small burrs removed prior to being made up into an assembly with a top gear cone clutch. Process 17 Take 1 looks like a well-rehearsed reassembly of a 75 crankshaft into the crankcase. The operator is having some difficulty because the main bearing on the right-hand side near to the helical gear also controls crankshaft end float, has very little clearance and requires precise alignment to allow the crank to fall into position. Notice that the 75-90 engine has no crankshaft damper. When it is fitted, however, it consists of 2 small flywheels frictionally clamped on either side of the flange seen integral with the helical gear. Here we can see pistons being assembled onto their connecting rods, and the caliper is used to check the straightness of the rod. The remarkably advanced 2-piece piston had an aluminium crown and iron skirt united by the gudgeon pin. Tapping the pin into the piston crown is a surprise, as the fit necessary for use ought to be easily assembled by hand. However, assembling the piston onto the connecting rod is more difficult due to the very close fit necessary, and the mallet is required. Similarly, close fit is essential in both the connecting rod and the tiny cotter groove in the gudgeon pin for the small cotter bolt to prevent any movement between pin and rod. A perfectly satisfactory and well-proven system, but only if great precision is maintained. It seems a simple task assembling the piston horizontally into the vertical cylinder block. Again, notice that the small dab of grease was used on the big end bore. The rough cast inlet and exhaust ports are smoothed with a hand grinding wheel to improve the performance on this 105 cylinder head. And this 95 head is pre-assembled with polished inlet, exhaust manifolds and water manifold and carburettor. The famous Talbot needle push rods are easily popped into place, to be followed by the fulcrum and rockers. In the engine test shop, the engines are hand cranked for starting, and the valve clearances are set up with the engine running, a unique feature of Talbot design. It is interesting to note that on this engine the cooling fan is running and will be quite dangerous for the operator. and obviously this is for the purpose of the film only. Here we can see the rockers being adjusted, with the lock nut being undone and then the adjusting screw changed. A view from the front of the engine shows in this case that the fan is stationary, as would be normal practice. The pre-selector gearbox uses a series of simple epicyclic gear trains linked together. Each train consists of a sun wheel in the centre, meshing with 3 planet gears mounted in the carrier, all set inside an internal annulus gear, which is usually the brake drum. The fitter progressively assembles the gear set, starting with reverse, then adding first, second and third gear trains to produce the complete gear set, which he then fits into the gearbox casing. The test shop running included checking out the pre-selector gearbox. The top cover is removed so that each gear can be seen to be engaging, and that pumping the clutch pedal causes the automatic brake band adjuster to set itself to the clamping force dictated by the square-headed stop screws. The tester is double checking the third gear auto adjuster by deliberately unscrewing the adjuster nut a little, refitting the loop spring and pumping the pedal to observe that the automatic adjustment is taking place. The powerful 400mm diameter self-servo front brake shoes are fitted to the back plate. The 2 shoes are hinged together, and the brake application applies only the leading shoe, which in turn applies the trailing shoe with much greater effort. And here we can see the camera operated leading shoe being operated. The brake drum is then fitted. The spiral bevel pinion and its support bearing have already been set up with the correct bearing clearances and locked into place in this torque tube. The differential casing is now screwed on, but is not yet fully engaged to allow plenty of room to fit the crown wheel and differential assembly. Having the torque tube clamped firmly in a horizontal position allows the differential assembly to be rotated to enable easy assembly of the side bearings and subsequently their fine adjustment to get the precise clearance for the teeth of the crown wheel and pinion gears. The steering box assembly shows a simple and efficient worm and nut system. The nut sits in a forked arm attached to the drop arm, which follows an arc as the steering wheel and its tube are turned. The fitter here can be seen assembling the internal control levers which operate the choke and throttle before fitting the second half of this housing. These controls are operated from the centre of the steering wheel. The complicated thermostatically controlled radiator shutters are a tricky assembly operation, but our fitter is clearly an expert. He then fits the handsome chromium-plated outer shell. The system works extremely well, preventing overcooling and overheating, just as the designer intended. This trolley-mounted 75 engine and pre-selector gearbox assembly is rolled under the raised front of the chassis, which is then lowered into place. After some persuasion, the engine bolts are fitted. Similarly, the back axle with workshop wheels is rolled into position under the rear end of the chassis. The torque tube is fed over the centre crossmember and into the back of the gearbox, and the spherical housing is bolted into place. A rubber seal ring is fitted into the radiator water boss feed extension of the crankcase, and a similar dummy support for the offside rubber pad fitted. The radiator assembly is then carefully put into place. The front chassis has now been hoisted up to allow the trolley supporting the engine to be removed, and the front axle with its new wheels and tyres can be rolled into place, and the U bolted into position. Magically, we now have a fully dressed rolling chassis, requiring only a small adjustment to the brake pedal position before being fitted with one of the rudimentary test bodies used on all cars. We can see 7 chassis fitted with these bodies, plus some finished cars taking their final road test check. This is the body shop with the adjacent Darracq works, where frames are being made using templates to define the exact shape. The large stock of seasoned ash is kept in the workshop to help stabilise the timber before use. The labour-intensive nature of coach building is well illustrated by the short wheelbase Noel Rees style bodies taking shape in the body shop. The halves of the rear quarter are being smoothed into shape, ready for the padded black fabric covering. The man fitting the boot lid seems to be in a quandary, whilst the front hinges are finally screwed into place. The full extent of the skilled carpentry work is well illustrated in this view. This 6-light long wheelbase saloon is being power disc sanded to take out the blemishes prior to painting. The squeaks and rattles department has an unusual test rig on which a finished but untrimmed body is attached whilst a twisting action is applied. The operator has a stethoscope and listens to the flexing joints to detect unacceptable noise. Talbots were very proud of their quality control with regards to squeaks and rattles, and developed techniques as we see here to check that the thick layers of waxed fabric between the panels and the body were being effective. Here we can see steel bonnet sides being prepared ready for painting, and here they are being dropped into a hot degreasing tank and cleaning tank prior to that painting. Here we can see front wings being removed from the tank. The high temperatures are used to help a self-drying situation. The wings are then transferred and lowered onto a rack, which is then moved into a drying cabinet. For painting, the body is seated on a castered trolley to easily be rotated for spraying the whole body. And here we can see the operator rotating the body to get round to the back. Women are employed to rub down the early coats using power disc mops. It would appear that the finished painted body is raised into a dustproof housing to allow the last coat of paint to harden free from dust. And here we can see it being raised into the box. This also allows the spray painting of the underside to be done for maximum weather protection. Now the hide upholstery is being fitted to the rear seat cushions, whilst another fitter is checking that the large sunshine roof will operate smoothly and easily. Here we can see that the completed cars being driven around the test track, which we originally saw in 1905 and still being put to good use in 1932. In fact, it still existed in 1984 when the STD register visited there. Brand new cars are here lined up in front of the factory, waiting for their new owners. Perhaps a small number of minor blemishes being sorted out. Here we can see a member of the sales team greeting his new owner. Paperwork being completed and the car ready for handing over to the new owner. In this case, tray plates have been fitted prior to the car being sent off. Everything seems to be in order. The new owners are departing proudly with their new Talbot.
Back in 1930, the new 18 horsepower Talbots had caught the eye of Arthur Fox of Fox and Nickel Limited, who was looking for a car suitable for competition. An 18 horsepower engine was fitted to the short 1445 Scout chassis, and with lightweight sports bodywork, the Talbot 90 was born. And so began the great racing and rallying successes of Talbot. In 1930, the Talbot 90 team won first and second in class at Le Mans, and were third and fourth overall, despite fighting against much bigger Mercedes, Alfa Romeos and Bentleys. Here is one of the Talbots in typical pose, snapping at the heels of a Bentley, with more than twice the engine capacity and supercharged too. Le Mans was followed by the Irish Grand Prix at Phoenix Park in Dublin, where we see the cars at the start of the race. It's amazing what photographers will do to get the best picture. First, second and third in class was achieved, and these fantastic successes were repeated at the Tourist Trophy Race and the Brooklands 500 in the same year. Spurred on by these successes, a new 3-litre engine was installed in the same chassis for the following year, the Talbot 105. Here, at Le Mans, in 1931, George Roche talks with Arthur Fox, the sponsor. With them are Charlie Joyce on the left and Archie Pass on the right. Pass and Joyce were to pick up the sponsorship in later years. The Talbot 105s are in the background. The race is off. One Talbot retired after 18 hours when it was in second place overall, but the other went on to win its class, coming third overall and second on handicap. The Talbot winning drivers, Rose Richards and Saunders Davies, have plenty to celebrate with George Roche. The Talbot record that year at Brooklands, the Irish Grand Prix and the Tourist Trophy was uniquely firsts, seconds and thirds in class. You must not forget that all this was achieved using a straightforward overhead valve engine with a single carburettor in essentially a touring car chassis, and all against competitors using bigger, multi-carburetted, supercharged or twin-cam engines in special lightweight chassis. They did have plenty to celebrate, not just the 1931 Le Mans. 1932 started with the Mille Miglia, in which the one Talbot entered was again pitched against enormous odds. It was in 4th place when it crashed after 870 miles. In 2 hours, a crowd of locals had pulled the Talbot back on the road, and the badly damaged car finally finished in 25th place. Brooklands, Le Mans and the Tourist Trophy races followed. This is the scene at the start of the Brooklands 1,000-mile race in June. Only 7 cars finished, 3 of which were the team of 3 Talbots. How's that for invincible? A team of 3 105 Vanden Plas Tourers was entered in the Alpine trial, in which they won the team prize without loss of marks. This feat was repeated in 1934 with another team of 105s lined up here in Hanover Square, London. The early 1930s were difficult times in the economy as a whole, and in the motor industry. For example, the average price of a private car halved between 1924 and 1934. Even though Clement Talbot was successful, the STD group was taken over by the Rootes Group in January 1935. Despite Rootes' recognition of Talbot tradition and quality, as outlined in this folder sent to dealers at the time, the fine promises of energetic maintenance of the range didn't last long. It must be said, though, that one of their first moves to replace the 65 with the new 10 horsepower Talbot was successful enough to send production back above the 2000 mark. This was an attractive little car, the pretty clothing of which hid Hillman Mink's mechanical components. True to tradition, this was available with special bodywork by Abbott. Rootes, in their efforts to see this new chapter of expansion and prosperity at Talbot's, introduced, as you'd expect, many changes. Some good, such as this moving production line. Some perhaps not so good, such as the brash salesmanship shown here, which can't quite have been the way things had been done in the past. In contrast, production of larger Talbots continued with styles developing over the years. This is an airline saloon in suitable pose, and this 105 is the BI model with drop chassis and the speed saloon body. A large proportion of cars was fitted with the bodies of specialist coach builders, frequently by Vanden Plas, who made this Alpine Tourer body in recognition of the success in the Alpine Rally. This 3.5 litre Talbot 110 has a drop-head coupe body by James Young. Many less common coach builders also put bodies on Talbot chassis, such as this model by Offord on a 1937 Talbot 110. Talbots continued to produce quality, luxury motor cars, but catering for a declining market in the face of ever stronger competition from the mass-produced marques. Luxury features included the flask in this headrest, and the microphone for instructing the chauffeur in this limousine. Very few were made. These larger models, increasingly using Humber components to make cost savings, became increasingly mundane in performance and with standard bodies in style too. The Talbot name was dropped in favour of Sunbeam Talbot in 1938, but production continued at Barlby Road until Second World War. The Talbot sporting heritage lived on. Private owners continued their success in races and rallies as they always had. Kitty Brunel is seen here doing a little light maintenance to her 1929 Monte Carlo 1445 Sportsman's Coupe. She was one of only 24 finishers out of 93 starters in that year, a major feat for a lady driving a standard, fairly heavy car. And here she is again in 1930, having just negotiated the hairpin ascent behind her. Talbot owners regularly toured Europe in the 1930s. This group is waiting to embark at Dover for another tour of the Alps, before the days of roll-on, roll-off car ferries. Excitement at the Swiss border, high on the Stelvio Pass, and lined up for the official photograph. For all lovers of invigorating, fast and reliable, go-anywhere motoring, what better than a Talbot? And of course, that's still the case today. The Sunbeam Talbot Darracq Register runs frequent rallies and meetings and works to keep Talbots racing, rallying and just driving around giving their owners pleasure. Talbots were taken to New Zealand for their Millennium Rally. Paul Easter has organised nearly 20 trips to France, Spain or Switzerland. Nearer to home, there are rallies and meetings most weeks in the summer, and in the winter months there are great meetings at the home of Bob and Margaret Frost. The treasured 1930s team cars are still going strong 70 years later. Here they are at the Centenary Rally at Brooklands, the home of many of their triumphs. BGH 23 and BGH 21 are two of the 1934 Alpine Trial team, which won the team prize without loss of marks. Go 51 is one of the Go team of 1931 and 1932. PL4, PL3 and PL2 is the 1930 team of Talbot 90s, two of which crashed so disastrously at Brooklands, but which still went on to great successes at Le Mans, the Irish Grand Prix, the Tourist Trophy and the Brooklands 500. And they don't just stand still. Here's BGH 23 putting in the best time of the day up the Brooklands Test Hill. And PJ 7363, one of the 1932 Alpine Team 105s, showing it can still make short work of steep hills when it's over 70 years old. Great successes against enormous odds are still achieved in Talbots, such as the challenge to drive a pre-1931 car from London to Sydney to mark the Australian bicentenary. James Wheeldon and Paul Davies set out down through Europe and across the Sahara, at night when it was cool enough to do so. There was some proper road on the way down to Nigeria. Then east, across darkest Africa, Congo, Zaire, Uganda. Among the many obstacles overcome was the crossing of the Mongala River at a point marked Ferry on the map. The old ferry from colonial days had, of course, sunk to the bottom long ago. So side saddle on 3 dugout canoes sufficed for the mile-wide crossing. Then up onto the old jetty on the other side. Then on to Mombasa on roads so potholed that grounding meant delays while the Talbot was jacked up and out of the hole. From the port of Mombasa to Singapore, and then to Perth and across Australia to Sydney, arriving not only first, but so early that the trophy had not even been made. And with no backup, support crew or assistance, except what they fought for on the way. Another challenge couldn't be ignored by Willie and Carrie Balfour, who, to celebrate the millennium, are seen here leaving Tower Bridge in London to go around the world in 80 days, in their 1933 Talbot 105. As part of a group of 42 vintage and classic cars, they went off across Europe and over the Bosphorus into Asia, through Georgia, round the Caspian Sea, and here in Kyrgyzstan, heading into the Celestial Mountains. And after 10,000 miles, into China, known for its border guards, and, of course, the Great Wall. Then by Antonov transport plane to the Yukon, Alaska, and first signs of American influence. Time for a full service before heading across Canada and the USA, leaving from New York to Marrakesh in North Africa, where temperatures reach 50 degrees C, 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The Talbot carried on among the survivors heading home via Tangier. Driving over 20,000 miles in 79 days, the Talbot was the oldest car to make it all the way round and home. Let's go back to 1903 and look at the oldest surviving Talbot, a 100-year-old 1903 French-built 18 horsepower. Every Talbot owner has his photo album of memories of happy times he's had in his Talbot. In 2003 we looked back 100 years. Could the Earl of Shrewsbury and Talbot, Adolphe Clement or Georges Roche have looked forward to this centenary year and foreseen the number of their cars still on the road and the enthusiasm with which they are cared for and driven? I really hope they did.